Welcome, humans. We have gone past another reset, and with one reset that goes by, we're getting closer to the release of Season 4. Brand new season, brand new rotation of dungeons for Mythic Plus, with old returning dungeons like Mechagon, like Karazhan, and like the older Warlords dungeon, Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot, as well as the new raid rotation system with the fated affix that we're gonna have to test to try out in Season 4. As the season comes close, we get the same itch. The players naturally get the same call, almost like the One Ring from the Lord of the Rings. As every time you get close to a new season, you start hearing the call, the whispers of, what if you play a different spec? Haven't you thought about re-rolling? So, as the season gets close, you start thinking about, should I try out this new spec? Is my spec going to get gutted because it's a flavor of the month spec? Is it time to jump ship? Or perhaps the opposite. I am sick and tired of getting declined from keys because I fell for the meme and chose to play Shadow Priest. It's time to go play something else. Perhaps you were a hopeful player rolling Havoc because you thought Havoc was going to be the best in slot Mythic Plus melee spec. It turned out not to be one. You want to change. So this is where we start going over the specs to think, to argue whether or not it's worth playing them for the last season of this expansion. After all, it's not going to be too long of a season. After all, we are keeping most of the catch-up mechanisms from last season. There is not going to be anything new that you have to continuously grind, right? There is not going to be a new faction that you have to grind to Revered or to Exalted to gain the powers of. There is not going to be a limit and a wait for you to get a second legendary, to get your tier set, the creation catalyst charges that have kept accumulating up until now. You must have by this point something like 30 catalyst charges, so it is much easier, for example, to instantly get a full tier set on whichever character. As long as you get the item, you just turn into a tier set from the creation catalyst. Even if it's a new character, you're still gonna retain all of the charges from the before. It's gonna be much faster to get your double legendary. You have the catch-up mechanism now that allows you to instantly get to Renown 60 and have the full soulbind trees unlocked basically on every character you want. So it's also much easier this upcoming season to get a character up and running and effectively only need gear, only need to jump in Mythic Plus and start getting some gear. It's also not been specified by Blizzard, so we can continue to believe, perhaps hope, that there is not going to be a weekly lockout system for Valor upgrades and Valor points. Perhaps we might assume that Valor will not be capped at the 750, 800 Valor every week that we had the limit of until a few weeks into this season, into Season 3. It should be quite relatively faster, as you should by the end of an expansion, to gear up your characters, which is why I have to start thinking, and then I'm gonna share this with you, which characters to play in the next season. Why would you play this character? Should you play this character even if you like it a lot? Is it actually going to allow you to get into Mythic Plus groups, for example? Is it going to allow you to get a good chance of being represented in the raid? For this one, we are going to start focusing on the more popular of roles, which is the ranged DPS. As it stands, it is the role with the most popular picks. The most amount of the player base chooses to be a ranged DPS. So we start with them first. Now, the situation for the ranged DPS at the moment, I would lay it down this way. I would put Destruction Warlock at the top, together with Demonology Warlock at the top. I would put them in a healthy situation when it comes to Fire Mage, when it comes to Frost Mage, and when it comes to Marksmanship Hunter. They have all been utilized quite a bit in both Mythic Plus and Red Encounters. Below them, I would put the middle of the pack, which is kind of okay, but not great either, which is Elemental Shaman, Balanced Druid, and Beast Mastery Hunter. And then lastly, you have the leftover stuff. You have Affliction, you have Shadow Priest, and you have Arcane Mage. So this is the situation right now. We do know out of this entire situation that thing right there, right at the top, Destruction, is getting nerfed at the start of Season 4. Unfortunately, this type of prediction, this type of thinking about what to play might be a little bit off, because we still don't know if that's gonna be the end of the balance tuning. If perhaps by the time Season 4 comes out we are getting something more beyond what we just know, beyond what we already know, which is Destro and Survival are getting their AoE damage nerfed. Perhaps we get some more balance tuning, which is what I'm hoping for. But at the moment, the specs I would immediately cut off for having no hope, because historically it just doesn't happen, is Arcane and Shadow Priest. It's just very hard to have hope in these two specs. Shadow Priest just needs their usual new expansion complete overhaul to have any hopes of them becoming somewhat good. So if they haven't been as meta for this entire expansion, hoping that even some slight balance tuning happening by the end of season 3 is going to change something, that's not going to happen. Arcane, it has been far too overshadowed, this entire expansion, by either Fire and Frost, so it's logical to continue to believe that Fire and Frost will continue to do better. Warlock is perhaps, despite the nerfs to Destruction, is perhaps still the most likely to be chosen, because even after the nerfs, perhaps Destruction will continue to have a very high, very strong and competitive AoE damage, which will still make them viable and meta in Mythic Plus, and even then, even if Destruction ended up being hurt more than we think, you still have Demonology, which is a quite powerful spec at the moment anyways, so you would have quite a lot of chances, if choosing to play Warlock, to remain quite healthy in the meta in Season 4. The same goes for Hunter, although on a lower level. Hunter would be the discount version of Warlock. Excluding Survival, just talking about the ranged specs of Hunter. Marksmanship is doing fine, Beast Mastery has gotten buffed, it has now passed Marksmanship in popularity in the raid, so you have Marksmanship being more popular in Mythic Plus, Beast Mastery being more popular in the raid. It's a pretty decent and healthy situation. Hunters historically are quite popular, are very popular. They are the most popular spec actually for DPS in terms of players choosing the specs, so they are still always quite in the meta one way or another. This season perhaps even more, because Survival as well, out of nowhere, for the first time since Legion, also became a very meta spec. I would say when it comes to the safest picks for choosing a ranged DPS in the next season would be Warlock and Hunter. Despite the incoming nerfs to Destruction, it would still be a safe pick. Obviously, these type of videos, if you wanted them to, could also be very, very short. You want to play a ranged DPS? Play Mage or Warlock. Statistically, because they have 3 specs each, they are the most likely to become viable at any given time. You want to play a melee DPS? Play Rogue or Death Knight or Warrior, because statistically they have the most specs to choose from, so they are the more likely to have a meta spec being viable. These type of discussions can end up being quite short like that, but if you want to say a little bit more about the situation, I personally, as I said, wouldn't put too much hope in Shadow and Arcane. I would also drop Affliction almost entirely and have still quite little hope on Elemental. But Elemental is a little bit better off at the moment, but you know, the hopes of them somewhat rising out of nowhere, getting buffed in the balance tuning, are quite low. So as boring as it sounds, if you wanted to stay in the meta, to make sure you have a pick that can always be quite valued in both Mythic Plus and with encounters, the most logical options unfortunately are also the most boring ones, because it would be Warlock, Mage and Hunter. Just because of their current situation. It's not that they currently have bad specs to play, underplayed, underpowered specs. At the very least, 1 or 2 in their class is quite good. Fire and Frost are both doing fine. Demo and Destro, even post-nerf, will likely still do fine. So unfortunately the chances are like that. If I were to risk, okay, let's look at the other side of the coin. What if you are a hipster? What if you don't want to do like any other guy? I'm not like other girls, and I don't want to play the same flavor of the month stuff. I don't want to be passing for the guy who is chasing the top meters with the flavor of the month spec. I just want to play what I find fun, what I find engaging and entertaining, and it just so happens to be one of the hybrids, one of the hipster specs. Balance Druid or Elemental Shaman or Shadow Priest. Those are my off meta, less popular picks, even though Balance Druid is still very popular. If I were to choose between them, it is likely I would still stick for Balance Druid. mostly because yes, you get told repeatedly that Balanced Druid is at the bottom of the meters, it's performing the worst, but trust me, in red encounters it is still a very wanted spec because of their damage profile and their very high burst damage they can do when they are Ventier. Even when they are Nightfey, they still have a decent damage profile despite the low overall damage. It is, however, quite specifically speaking, shit in Mythic Plus. So if I had to look at the hipster spec from a Mythic Plus standpoint, then I would perhaps move over to Elemental Shaman. At the very least, they are more powerful in Mythic Plus, despite not being as popular as Balanced Druid overall. That would be my pick. Of course, way more over Shadow Priest at the moment. So if I were to start thinking about Season 4 and looking at which specs to play, these would be my picks when it comes to the meta, when it comes to the likelihood of these specs retaining their power when we get into Season 4. What is the chance of you getting invited into a Mythic Plus key or getting to be part of the core roster of a raid based on the spec you're choosing? Those would be my picks. Of course, then we can enter into the complete fan fiction and try to think about which of the specs will end up being buffed and which of the specs will end up being nerfed, if any balance tuning at all is going to happen in Season 4, but that would be quite impossible to predict, so it's much harder. Then you have the last point. You have the last point about thinking about what to play. It's not just about the meta. It's not just about how much you will become popular. It's not just about how much this... Oh. It's not just about how much the spec will be popular. Sometimes you enjoy a certain spec. Sometimes you are cozy in your Mythic Plus team, in your raid roster. You have already a group of people to play with. You don't fear getting rejected by people because you're playing a less popular spec. So you purely want to go with what's entertaining, what is engaging, what has more variety. Do I get to change my talents, my legendaries, my conduits, or even my spec in between the same class? Within the same class, depending on the activity, the amount of variety and fresh stuff you get to do in the game with a certain spec. That might be what draws you towards a certain spec. And it is very sad. It is very sad, I have to point this out, because even in this very example, which is different than the complete opposite from simply playing what's the strongest, one of the possible better options is also happens to be the strongest option, because it's Warlock. Again, currently the difference between Destruction and Demonology is quite varied. The two specs play quite differently. They have a quite different, very different rotation and setup they need to have. They both also do much different things in single target for Demonology compared to the AoE of Destruction. They can also change talents quite a bit, in particular Destruction more so than Demonology. So even in this case, even if you weren't purely looking at the strongest, but you wanted to look at the more varied, the more options and differences in play, Warlock would still be a pretty high, solid choice in this regard. Choices with much less room, much less differences would be Shadow Priest, would be Elemental Shaman. Unfortunately, there is some variety in Balanced Druid, not in the way you would play, not in the rotation you would play, in the conduits you would play, but more so in the difference between Ventier and Nightfey, between Ravenous Frenzy and between Convoke the Spirits. That would be the main difference if you wanted to play Balanced Druid. You also have Hunter as usual. This is an endless topic I will never understand. Some people actually enjoy the playstyle of Hunter, whether it's marksmanship or whether it's BM. They find it quite soothing. You click the same 3 buttons very often. The difficulty in the rotation is very subdued. It's very chill. It's not as easy to mess up. So it's quite laid back, to perform as a hunter. So perhaps many players enjoy that. They enjoy chilling, whether they are playing BM or marksmanship, in a much more laid back rotation. So if you are one of those guys, Hunter would be the best pick for you, because it is much less precise and much less risk heavy in the amount of damage you can lose if you don't set up your damage properly, as opposed to Demonology, as opposed to Balanced Druid. Perhaps that is also a draw for some players in how appealing a certain spec is going to be. So unfortunately, I wanted to make the divide between what if you want to play a meta spec and what if you want to play a spec that's fun or entertaining or diverse, and in the end I ended up getting sort of the same answers, because if it comes with meta, I would have went with Warlock, followed by Hunter, followed by Mage, and if it was about variety and diversity and change in your playstyle, I would have went with Warlock and then Hunter anyways. So it ends up being kind of the same result, the same answer. But if you want to know my personal opinion, just what I would play regardless of all of this and simply what I find more fun, I would have went with Elemental Shaman, since it's been my favorite range DPS spec since BFA, since they turned the spec around a bit. After that I would have gone with Demo, and then Fire Mage, and then Balanced Druid, when it came to the enjoyment I have in playing the spec, in finding the rotation fun. So that would have been my personal opinion in terms of playing, choosing what to play when it comes to range DPS in Season 4. Obviously, we might want to revisit this as we get close to Season 4, and perhaps, finally, bless the gods, we get some balance tuning. We might want to revisit this to see if things are changing, in which specs look more likely, look more in pole position to become the meta spec or the wanted spec or the needed spec, etc., for the next season. So that is something we might want to revisit, and all of you, I hope, should wish that we will revisit this, because it means we get some changes, we get some switch around, some power shifts in the meta happening because of balance tuning. At the end of this video, we can recap this with how many times I mentioned the word balance tuning throughout the video. I believe it's 24 times perhaps by now. But yeah. As we get closer to the next season, of course, my need for a balance tuning gets more and more powerful, so I get drawn to repeating those words more and more. I hope I'm not alone in this sentiment. But for today, we can stop with the range DPS, because as usual, I dragged this video long for way too long. It was supposed to be both DPS, but being succinct and short in my points is not my strong suit. So of course we dragged this video on for way too long. So we're going to stop here and continue with this overview / review of what to play in Season 4 next, with probably the melee DPS being after the ranged ones. And for this we can stop for today. Thank you guys, of course, for watching the video and for helping and contributing to grow the channel, which also includes liking this video as well as commenting down below. Not for last, if you don't know what to say and you're quite shy in voicing your opinion, then this will also do as well. You can also subscribe to the channel for even further help. That would be greatly appreciated. Just like following me on Twitter for always the most based and on-point takes on WoW, as well as further support being achieved by subscribing to my Patreon, which will also give you access to my Discord channel if you ever feel the need to ask me something, share some points of view, perhaps some thoughts and tips on what content to have next, etc. That would always be appreciated as well. With this being said, I have to go and raid today, so thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, you see, this is why I hate the summer. You finally see some clouds, you finally see rain coming in, and all it's gonna do is giving you 80% humidity and make it look like it's 55 degrees instead of 35. Shit.